I know you're probably fed up with this pandemic, but an increasing number of experts think the next one could come upon us long before we expect it. And one reason is climate change with its effects on ambient temperatures and extreme weather events. Last week, a group of researchers published a paper in the prestigious journal Nature showing how, with climate change, as animals move to different habitats, they meet new animals they haven't experienced before and share their viruses, with the risk that new ones emerge and spill over to humans. One of the authors is Colin Carson, who's in the Centre for Global Health Science and Security at Georgetown University in Washington, D.C. I spoke to him earlier.
We're trying to get at something really quite simple in this study, which is that climate change is restructuring ecosystems. It's putting animals in new places. And we're trying to figure out what that means in terms of where they'll bring viruses.
And then you did some modelling to look at the extent to which animals will move or are moving with
That's right.
temperature and change and presumably sea level rise.
That's right. So we've basically been running simulations on and off for about 3 years. First, we look at where species habitats are going to move to in terms of temperature, in terms of, do they need to live in a place with forests in it, things like that. So we simulate that over the next 50 years. And then we look at when species get where they're going, how they'll share viruses with each other and how that might lead to disease emergence.
And what have you concluded?
It's pretty grim. So most animals are going to have to move a little bit. And that means that most animals are going to meet at least somebody new they've never met before, which means that there is a pretty massive change probably already happening in mammals in terms of their viruses. And that's bad news for us. We think about this a little bit like how SARS jumped from bats to civets to humans in a wildlife market. What we're looking at is viruses making those kinds of jumps really at a planetary scale over the next 50 years.
And you've suggested that the rate of transmission is going to increase 4,000 times.
Yeah, so what we think will happen is at least 4,000 pairs of species are going to share at least some viruses. Now, that could be just one virus, or it could be everything that they're infected with. So it's quite a massive change when you think about the fact that there's only about 6,000 mammals, right? So we are talking about a total restructuring of which species have which pathogens.
And is it mostly bats?
So bats are kind of at the heart of this, and it's an unexpected pattern. We're used to thinking about bats as special in terms of disease. We think that they have these kind of special adaptations that let them host very dangerous viruses and maybe not get sick from them. But bats also do something else quite important, right? Which is they fly. And from the vantage point of climate change, that matters quite a lot. The ability to fly into new ecosystems, to go further and faster, really puts bats at the center of this, I think, in quite an unexpected way. But something like 90% of the viral sharing that we think might be coming down the road could have to do with bats, which is, again, pretty alarming when it comes to then human health.
So at the moment, they've agreed to keep things within 1.5 degrees increase within the century. Most people say that's not going to happen. It's going to be 2 degrees. Is the extent of this sharing inevitable now? You're just predicting the inevitable, or could it reverse?
It's a great question. Let's take a step back and think about sort of that century-long change, right? So we live in a world that's, about 1.1 to 1.2 degrees warmer already. We're on track to blow right past 1.5. Ideally, with existing commitments, we'd stay under 2. But if we stayed where we are today, we would have a planet warming by about 3 degrees by the end of the century, which is quite a lot. What we learned very unexpectedly in our study is that out of that sort of full range of possibility, it's really that first degree of warming that matters the most, because really what we're studying is species meeting for the first time, and a very small amount of climate change can set that in motion. And so what we found is most of this change has probably already been set in motion. And if we cut greenhouse gas emissions, now don't get me wrong, it'll save millions of lives, it'll save thousands of species from extinction. We have to cut greenhouse gas emissions, but it doesn't get us out of this particular problem.
So 2 questions. The first one is, do we have any fix on how many of these new viruses, as a result of mingling between species, will be what are called zoonoses, in other words, spillovers able to go into human populations?
We think there's probably about, let's call it 40 to 60,000 viruses in mammals. And out of those, as many as 10,000 could infect humans, right? So quite a lot. We only know about 200 or 300 of these that currently infect humans. So there's quite a lot waiting in ecosystems that could still emerge.
Second question is, you've given a fairly somber scenario that's already in place. What can we do about it now?
That's a great question. I think there's three things we can do. The first is we can do the science, right? We can track these viruses in ecosystems. We can try to notice when they show up in new places. And that means that we're better informed. The second thing that we can do is we can try to catch outbreaks in humans earlier. There's a statistic that I think about all the time. One scientist has estimated that we're probably missing about half of all Ebola virus outbreaks. They come and go and we just never notice them. And that is not a present day where we're ready to face something like this, right? So we can build better health systems. And then I think the last thing is, if we are locked in for this, if this is a climate change impact we're not going to be able to dodge, I really think we got to hold fossil fuel companies accountable for that. We've had decades to off-ramp from the most dangerous impacts of climate change, and now we're here, right?
So a tax on them to pay for the next pandemic.
I mean, I if we're looking for money, right? No, but I mean, I think it's part of the reality of living in a warmer world, right? We should be able to look at the things happening around us and say, oh, this is where this came from, right? And that might not be true of this pandemic, but it certainly could be true of the next one.
Colin, thank you for joining us on the Health Report.
Thanks so much.
So do we have to wait for the next catastrophe before we act? Colin Carlson is in the Centre for Global Health Science and Security at Georgetown University in Washington, D.C. And this is RN's Health Report. I'm Norman Swan.